all this time, we've been assuming that you can't manufacture in the United States. So I think it's very interesting that literally the richest guy in human history manufactures in the United States. Right. I've been to the factory. I saw it. It's real. Actually, the SpaceX factory, it's sort of almost like a 1950s GM factory or something like that. You would expect a rocket factory to be like extremely, I don't know how to put it, Star Trek, you know? But you were asking what's innovation. That's sort of an interesting one, because I think a lot of what SpaceX did when they innovated is they figured out what they could get away with doing in stainless steel, what they could get away with doing at low tolerances, or like at poor tolerances instead of at high tolerances. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And so that's part of how you get a rocket launch that costs $50 million instead of $300 million. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. And that's innovation too. And as far as the kind of stuff I'm talking about with, you know, Chinese factories and whatnot, very often it's that extremely unsexy stuff, an extra gram of material saved here, an extra 10 minutes of transit time from one factory portion to the other saved here, an unnecessary manual inspection saved here, you know? And to the extent that we start seeing successful AI uptake in the United States, I think that's what we should be looking at is how we shave those pennies, because that's very often what AI is best at.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Nick Solheim. I'm the CEO of American Moment, and we're glad to have you back with us. We have a very exciting conversation with FCC Commissioner Nathan Simington. But before we get to that, as always, I got to run you through some of the cool things we have going on at American Moment. As always, if this is your first time listening to the podcast, if you're a real telecommunications old head and you'd love to, you know, get more involved with what we're doing, you can check out our website at americanmoment.org. We currently have applications open for the Fellowship for American Statecraft for this summer. You can find more information about that at americanmoment.org/fellowship. Basically, it's a fellowship program we run here in DC to help people start their career. We pay $3,000 a month. We place you in an internship somewhere on the Hill, the administration, or, you know, maybe in an allied institution. You spend all day with us on Fridays being indoctrinated, and then hopefully we find you a job before the end of the fellowship. So make sure to check that out. Applications are going to be closing soon. We have limited spaces available, so make sure to take a look at that. We also currently are running AM Fridays for the spring, though you'd also be welcome to join us in the summer as well. We cater a bunch of Chick-fil-A. We bring in cool speakers. It's open to anyone who already has an internship in DC. So if you haven't done so already, please fill out the form on our website. Come join us. We'd love to have you. It's americanmoment.org/AM Fridays. So now I'm going to get to our guest, Commissioner Nathan Simington, who is a repeat guest. We last had him on like 30 or 40 episodes ago. But there have been a lot of interesting developments in the last couple of weeks. You know, we're at the time of this recording, we're 3 weeks into the new Trump administration, and there's just so much winning. You can't pay attention to it all at the same time. So we had a great conversation with Commissioner Simington about all the exciting things going on at the FCC. He also wrote this great piece in American Affairs last year talking about Chinese industrialization and what we can do in America to compete. We spent a lot of time talking about that. And then for our bonus section, we talked significantly about space and Canadian politics. So it was a very, very entertaining show. So Commissioner Simington was nominated to serve as commissioner of the FCC by President Donald J. Trump. He was confirmed by the United States Senate in 2020. Commissioner Simington brings both private and public sector experience to the commission. Previously, he served as senior advisor at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. In this role, he worked on many aspects of telecommunications policy, including spectrum allocation and planning, broadband access, and the U.S. government's role in the internet. Prior to joining the commission, he was senior counsel to Brightstar, an international mobile device services company. In this capacity, he led negotiated telecommunications equipment and services transactions with leading providers in over 20 countries. Prior to joining Brightstar, he worked as an attorney in private practice. I also found out he plays the violin. It's super cool. Commissioner Simington is a graduate of the University of Michigan Law School. He also holds degrees from the University of Rochester and Lawrence University. He grew up in Saskatchewan, Canada, and became a United States citizen and now lives in McLean, Virginia with his wife and 3 children. Let's go now to Commissioner Nathan Simington. Commissioner Simington, thank you very much for coming back on the podcast.
It's always a pleasure.
So it's been a couple months. It was, I think, 30 episodes or so ago that we had you back on, but we take a little break around Christmas time. So let's get you reintroduced to all of our listeners. You're currently a commissioner at the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. Could you tell us a little bit about how you ended up doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So usually you get on by either working for a senator or by coming up through the telecom bar. And so I'm a little bit of an anomaly because I came up as a finance lawyer, and then before that I was a classical musician. That's a whole other story. That I don't know that counted as a qualification.
What did you play?
I'm a violinist by training.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Yeah, it's all right. So so I came up as a finance lawyer, and then during the first Trump administration, there's an agency within the Commerce Department, the NTIA. And that does a variety of broadband and radio spectrum issues. And they were looking to staff it up. So I got the call to join them. I joined them. And while I was working there, I got tapped for the FCC. And I have to say, there's always a learning curve. The FCC has a very deep bar, very deep body of precedent. But on the other hand, it's always good to come into these kinds of things with fresh eyes. And especially now in a time of transition.
Yeah. Yeah, we were talking about, just before the show, I was referencing this clip of the president where he's on the campaign trail and he's saying, you're going to be saying, Mr. President, stop, it's too much winning. Please, I can't take it anymore. And you were commenting that, the last 3 weeks feels like basically a year of progress, positive developments going on in the federal government. But basically, so much winning has meant that I have not really been paying attention to so many things that have been going on, including at the FCC. So give us the update. Like first, I think we're like 3 weeks in now.
3 weeks in.
What's been going on at the FCC?
Well, Chairman Carr was one of the first appointees designated by President Trump after the election. I believe he was designated something like 12 days after the election. So he was named before half the cabinet.
Yeah.
So this is obviously a very strong endorsement from President Trump. He's got a great relationship with Chairman Carr. Chairman Carr has, of course, he's very active on media issues. That's been all over the press. I think maybe something that hasn't gotten as much attention, but it's another significant thing that he's been doing. If you look at the first FCC meeting that's taking place after his chairmanship, under his chairmanship, the one that's coming up at the end of February, then what you see is a move towards commercializing an additional 200 megahertz of high quality, high value mid-band spectrum. And this, I would point out, is more new spectrum than was brought to market during the entire previous administration. So I think that's really setting the tone, right?
Yeah.
And the commercialization and densification of this mid-band spectrum is just a vital economic interest for the United States. Obviously, it's important for the cell phone industry as it presently exists, but just as important, if you look at the underlying specs of 5G, there's the ability to provide cell phone services that weren't possible before. But just as much, and if you look especially at China, it's an enabler for industrial technologies. You can imagine it as sort of like a super Wi-Fi that's much better suited to AI developments and to industrial controls and robotics. So I think this is a really significant decision by Chairman Carr. It's setting the tone for what I think is a change in direction of the FCC that fits its statute, but maybe is a little bit of a divergence, a positive divergence from its history. We always think of the FCC as the media regulator, right? And those were basically the two big portfolios. You had broadcasting, and then you had the phone company.
Yeah,
that was the status quo as of 1980. Then under Reagan, we broke up the phone company, so it got a little bit more complicated, and then cable became a bigger player, so the cable became a bigger part of our portfolio. But the overall portfolio is interstate and international communication by radio or by wire. And so that includes satellites as well. Not such a big deal in the 90s when there weren't that many satellites. Now, Starlink alone has over 6,000.
Yeah.
That's something like 30 times as many as we had in the entire world 30 years ago, right?
Yeah.
The proliferation has been crazy. So the FCC needs to evolve to keep up with that. And likewise, industrial communications, machine to machine, are a much more significant part of how industry functions these days. And so industrial modernization runs through the FCC. And either we recognize that fact and we adapt, or else at some point Congress is going to say, you guys are not adding value, you're getting in the way. And then at that point we have 2 spectrum regulators, 3 if you count the NTIA. So it becomes messy. I think it's best if we just pick up the ball and run with it.
Right. Yeah, I saw this, speaking of what you were saying about people normally thinking of the FCC as a media regulator. I saw this hilarious clip where Chairman Carr was on Fox and he was begging that there would be no wardrobe malfunctions during the Super Bowl,
right?
Which was very hilarious. And I think that's what most people think of when they think of the FCC, right? Like if you say a naughty word on television, we will fine you.
Yeah, right.
But you've been focused, very specifically on a lot of this, like future and like technology, like advanced technology oriented stuff. So how have you been viewing your role, as a commissioner, and what specific things have you been focusing on?
Well, the great thing about sitting on the commission is that since you regulate people, they want to be candid with you.
Yeah.
And so if you want to get the information, you can go ahead and generally get it. So it's really a question of what you want to do with that reach. As far as advanced technologies, just sticking with TV for a second, just sticking with the media regulation concept for a second, the United States has very, very strong speech protections compared to all the other developed countries. Right. So if you look at the CRTC, which is sort of the Canadian FCC, they have about a quarter the staff. But of course, Canada as a country is only about a tenth the size. Mm-hmm. And that's because media content regulation is a much bigger part of what happens in Canadian media. It's a much bigger part of what happens in German media, French media, UK media. In the United States, we've read First Amendment protections very broadly. And so, as a result, our broadcast media, it has strong norms. And the FCC, I think, correctly argues that when you broadcast, you're excluding anyone else from broadcasting on that spectrum. So there's a heightened interest in decorum and standards in speech. But we go a lot less far than most other countries in telling people what they can say over TV or over radio. And then, of course, when it comes to the internet, we have very little to say unless the speech is actually illegal for other reasons. So, that whole media regulation thing is is structurally a smaller part of what we do compared to every other media regulator on earth.
Right.
That said, on the other hand, just getting the physical transmission of television going is hard. There's so much to coordinate. There's so much in terms of permitted contours for a broadcast, power levels, interference, emergency continuity. So that isn't as visible to the public, obviously. But unless we're doing our jobs properly, that isn't there. Likewise, if we're saying what kind of format, what kind of technology can you use to broadcast, we're in the middle of a big transition right now, homegrown American technology to what's the so-called ATSC3 standard. Mm-hmm. And part of what's really exciting about that, they've actually been doing this in South Korea for a number of years, is they use that to push out updates to your car because it's much, much cheaper and running at a much higher power level than having a one-to-one cellular connection for every car in Seoul.
Interesting.
Or in our case, every car in New York City or Washington, D.C. or L.A. And I'm really excited about the potential that we get by making that tech transition happen. It's not something the public will directly notice in the same way that they notice what gets said on TV. But sometimes the medium is the message, and right. The ability to avoid Microsoft Patch Tuesday by just pushing up the updates over the waves.
Yeah,
it's a great way to take pressure off of other connectivity mediums. We sort of saw that with the Mike Tyson Netflix fight. That
right. Yes.
even with the vast power of Netflix, it's just hard to serve 39 million live streams on an individual one-to-one basis. Yeah. Even though that's something broadcast TV could, in a sense, have handled in the 1960s when we were watching on a little 9-inch black and whites. Yeah. Right. Because one-to-many is inherently so much more efficient at pushing out certain kinds of live events and other mass distributions. So that's the kind of technical back-end thing I like working on.
Yeah. So like one of the spaces that you occupy in my brain is as a demystifier of technology. I will never forget the last time you were on this show where you explained basically every aspect of these microphones sitting in front of us and how it works. So when you're talking about, these sort of like over-the-air updates, I mean, say you have like a Tesla or something like that, and you're getting, the new software update. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about? Like, explain it to us like we're 5.
No. I mean, I think that's a great example. I mean, Tesla has been doing wireless updating forever. And now, forever, as long as it's been around, which, let's remember, it's not that old a company. But it's sort of baked into Tesla's DNA that they're going to do over-the-air updates because it's a very software-driven auto company relative to some others. Right. But at this point, you can't afford to be out of the software business as an auto company. So everyone has to do connectivity. And there are companies with bigger installed bases, frankly, than Tesla, although Tesla's, catching up. They're selling a lot of cars these days. But if you're a company with a big installed base, you've got a huge amount of stuff to push out. Those might be map updates, bug fixes, might be engine optimizations. But that's just the tip of the iceberg because increasingly wireless devices are part of infrastructure. Mm-hmm. That could be something as unobtrusive and as part of the background visual noise as the point of sale terminal at a restaurant, right? Or the smart lock on your building, or it could be something like an inventory control cart in a hospital. Yeah. The kind of thing where adding the wireless functionality is a no-brainer. But as soon as you do, you've got an exposed attack surface. And increasingly we've got wireless equipment that is in all kinds of places, might be, let's say, operating a drawbridge, to cross over from National Harbor. It might be it might be in a power plant. And the idea that we're going to actually say all of this stuff is going to be watched and patched, and we're going to push up updates to all of it, could put a lot of pressure on one-to-one connections. So to the degree that it makes sense to make those mass distributed connections, I think that's very sensible.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question is, I think you mentioned originally that this was American technology, right?
That's right.
Originally. So
born in the USA. And flourished in South Korea. Yeah. So this is one of these areas where the last administration was taking the view that so long as there was one guy whose TV set was not capable, then there has to be both the old signal and then the new high def TCP/IP signal. Yeah. This is the kind of thing where I think at some point we have to ask, what is the price of not rolling the tech over? Right. And generally speaking, I think that's the question the last 4 years have really raised for me. What is the cost of not rolling the tech over? What is the cost of not rolling the processes over? It shows up in satellite as well. I mentioned that we've got this huge proliferation in satellites. I don't think anyone ever anticipated, I don't even think SpaceX anticipated the kind of volume they were going to be doing. Right. SpaceX says we want to build the truck to low Earth orbit. Well, they did it. Last year, SpaceX flew as many low Earth orbit missions as the space shuttle program did in its entire history. Yeah.
That's insane.
That's in 1 year. Yeah. If you look at like a launch cadence tracker for SpaceX, it's like, starting back in 2011, it's like poof, poof. And now it's like up 2-3 times a week, right? Yeah. It's become routine to do this kind of thing. So again, the FCC has got to sit there because if you want to send or receive signals, someone's got to be in charge of coordinating that. But at the same time, the idea that we can still basically use processes that were baked in 1999 in an age where we have this kind of launch, well, I mean, that's nuts. In the 90s when Motorola was putting up the Iridium constellation, they had to buy all the private launch capacity in the world. They had to go to, decommissioned Russian bases in Kazakhstan. They had to go to, the People's Liberation Army and hire Long March missiles. And that was just to put 66 satellites up. Yeah. I mean, an individual Falcon 9 will routinely put up 50 Starlinks per mission. Yeah. It's just a different world now. So we've, again, there's a cost to not updating our processes. Right. We're not quite at the level yet of having to go to Pennsylvania and go down into a mine, and do paper filings in the mine, with a limit on how fast you can process them. Right. But we're sort of only one step past that. It would be really nice. It'd be really nice to really fully modernize all of this stuff, to take a look at all of the capacities that the private sector has created over the last decade and say, forget what we did 30 years ago. 30 years ago, we were probably still painting on the walls of caves like Fred Flintstone or something like that. Who knows what we were doing 30, the question is, what are we doing now? What are we doing in 5 years?
Right. Yeah. We were talking about this being, technology that was created in America. And I suppose my follow-up question was going to be, what are the security implications of this? And I know we were talking about, the American people by and large are probably not going to notice that much of a difference beyond like, your like toaster isn't shooting laser beams at you, but
but that's it, right? I mean, because obviously no one has the time to sit down and do a full security audit of every piece of wireless equipment they come in contact with.
Right.
But people do get general impressions, and those are often very accurate in the aggregate. Mm-hmm. And I would say that people have got a sense of learned helplessness that you can't really trust technology. I mean, There are a lot of people, I live in Fairfax County Public Schools a few years ago had a major records breach on public school students. So, that means I have to monitor my kids' credit as they grow up because I don't know if there was identity theft in there, right? I'm hardly the only person in that situation. There were some 30,000 student records that were exposed. It's just become routine for us to expect that our personal information is going to be compromised and in a data leak at some point. And if that's what things are like for our individual, credit histories, medical histories, goodness only knows, then how are we going to trust those kinds of things in safety critical systems like aviation, right? How are we going to trust that in the operation of the national power grid, your local water utility, the things you depend on every day? Very often the regulation around these things, now I was just making fun of the Pennsylvania mine with the government employee retirement records, but of course there's a good reason for that, and that is back when paper records were the best way to do things. Then the idea is let's put those records in a place where they'll never be destroyed and where the conditions can be very controlled. So, I mean, for the time, it made sense. It doesn't maybe make as much sense 70 years later, but, that's the point. We have to change with the times. I would like Americans to have real confidence in the wireless infrastructure that's around them. I think that is actually, there are actually a number of very good tools that the FCC has to drive this. And there are people in the federal government who want this result. But the American people aren't going to believe it until they actually start experiencing greater digital security. And right now they're in a state of learned helplessness that is entirely justified.
Right.
So,
yeah, I went through actually a similar thing here in DC. I'm sure you saw this, but I think it was last year. It was DC HealthLink, which is like the mandated, insurance provider here in DC. I think it was basically everybody's records, including my kids too. So I'm doing the same thing. So no, I think that's great. One of the things that you mentioned earlier on was you were talking about this, the growth of machine to machine communication. Could you give us not just, where we're at in that situation right now, but how we got here and also how quickly we've gotten there since Trump was last in office?
Oh yeah, even just the last 4 years have seen a huge change. So let's step back a little bit to let's say 1980s, 1990s, the beginning of having enough compute available to do smart industrialization or to start doing computerized factories, to start using industrial robots. At the time, virtually all connections were wired. Wireless connectivity just wasn't fast enough, wasn't high bandwidth enough, and wasn't secure enough. So at the time, your cybersecurity exposure was not so great because let's say that you're installing robot welding arms in a factory. Someone wanted to hack those, he probably would have to actually, physically come in your factory and start splicing wires. It seems like, it seems like it's not the biggest threat, and they're certainly not going to be able to do it by remote control from another continent. Right. Now we fast forward to today, and we're in a different situation in terms of American share of world manufacturing, in the state of American manufacturing employment, the export profile of the United States. And I've been saying all these things, and I know that everyone who's hearing this thinks China, 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 because, China was not a factor really in world export markets in the 80s. There was a little bit of coastal export market in the Southeast for, the toy industry and things like that. We shouldn't disregard the toy industry. That's where a lot of the Chinese drone industry came from. But
that's true.
Yeah. But, cheap complex drones, not really so different from RC cars or, little remote control planes or something like that. But nonetheless, it wasn't a huge export industry. There weren't a lot of world-class products coming out of it. The differentiator was cheap labor. And 20 years ago, I would still say the differentiator was cheap labor. The idea with offshoring in the United States was always that, that we had some industrial jobs that really were not desirable to American workers. No one wants to go back to the conditions of, mill workers in the 1950s, and textile mills, and inhaling cotton, getting Miller's lung, right?
Yeah.
So we looked at, in the 90s, the early 2000s, we looked at a lot of our manufacturing industry, and we thought, these are never jobs that are going to have significant uptake in the United States. You're going to have to pay such a heavy, dirty, and dangerous premium on these jobs that it's just totally unaffordable. And meanwhile, there are countries that desperately need this employment, so it's win-win, and one hand washes the other. This combined, again, with some doctrines around capital efficiency coming out of, I think, overlearning certain lessons of investment from the 60s, 70s, 80s, to produce that era of globalization. But that era of globalization also was sort of an era of fragility. And, I think a lot of Americans are looking at the sort of employment they have now, and they're saying, well, actually, there are some manufacturing jobs in China that I might not mind having. Now that China's exporting 5 million cars a year, maybe I'd rather do that than, drive for Uber Eats. And at this point, it's like we look at a lot of these service sector jobs that have emerged, and it's like, are they actually better than manufacturing jobs, or is it just that we can only do service sector jobs now because we systematically dismantled manufacturing here to the point where that it would take a conscious turnover in how we think about it to start getting it back? Anyway, but as far as how that pertains to my job, the machine-to-machine side, people think of China as a low-wage jurisdiction. That was true 20 years ago. At this point, I don't look at wages in China as being the main differentiator any longer. They're starting to get up to, sort of wage levels in Mexico and whatnot. They're not wage levels in the United States, generally speaking, but I don't view wages as the differentiator. I mean, it's not cheap labor that lets the Chinese sell a $7,000 gas car or a $10,000 electric car. It is, I think, increasingly the use of AI-optimized, 5G-powered smart factories and smart logistics. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to put that out there, that the current generation of industrial production is increasingly reliant on machine-based optimizations. I started to realize the scale of this when I was looking at one specific series of hacks on the Bluetooth Low Energy tech stack.
Right.
And the article mentioned that the installed base in 2018 of Bluetooth Low Energy devices in the world was around 8 billion units. So
it's a lot.
That's a lot. Yeah. In fact, so you start to wonder, what's the ratio of advanced wireless devices to people? Is it 10 to 1? Is it 100 to 1? And certainly when I look at the use case for 5G in China, it's almost all private networking. It's not that much consumer phone, but there's tons of private networks in factories. I just can't draw any conclusion. That and Chinese universities have for some time now been opening specifically industrially focused AI departments. So it's all about manufacturing optimization, and it's not about DeepSeek or large language models.
Yeah,
it's about the boring stuff of developing, for example, an optical sensor that can do a quick look at processors going by on a production line. With processors, they get partitioned by quality. So you take the same unit, and then the one with a few more manufacturing defects gets sold as a 1.7 gigahertz chip, and the one with better internal performance, but still the same design, it gets sold as 1.9 or 2.1. So if you can do an optical diff on these and partition them effectively without having to do electronic testing, well, you save some money.
Right.
And it's very often it's a penny saved is a penny earned, and you do this incrementally 10,000 times across your production chain, and all of a sudden you're selling a $7,000 car. I don't know if there's no way to capitalize that in the United States, and if the FCC is standing in the way in various ways, then I think we're making a rod for our own backs. We get a better regulatory environment, and from that we could start to talk about reindustrialization.
Yeah, I do want to talk. I want to spend the bulk of this episode talking about that reindustrialization. But you mentioned DeepSeek. Would your take be that is, that all the people panicking about that it's sort of overrated as it compares to this, what the Chinese are doing in factories? Or
I guess I would just say it's orthogonal. I mean, from what I've seen, obviously, the headline "DeepSeek trained for $6 million" is totally bogus. As against that, DeepSeek does have some interesting stuff in it. I'm not really an AI guy, but I would note that that people who looked at key innovations in DeepSeek said it was a little bit better optimized for hardware, because at a certain point in the design, the DeepSeek folks said we can generally get away with using 8-bit rather than 32-bit registers. they did some testing and said the performance gain that we get from that far outweighs the slight edge case losses from it. So overall, they found a more efficient way based on thinking about the hardware a little bit more and about the abstract math. I don't want to say a little less, but not as exclusively about the abstract math. So there was that. And then they also had certain things where they were predicting multiple tokens ahead. So I think there were some genuine technical innovations, both in terms of efficiency and then in terms of design with DeepSeek. But of course, the headline number of trained for $6 million was completely wrong. I don't know how afraid we should be of DeepSeek. I don't know if LLMs are where all the interest is, though, because you were talking about industrial AI and how do I feel that compares with LLMs. I think it's really interesting that we have an arms race in LLMs in the United States, and that we have not seen a comparable arms race in terms of industrial AI.
Yeah.
When we say big tech in the United States, what we really mean is big SaaS and big media ad tech.
Right.
I mean, why isn't General Electric big tech? Mm-hmm. Why isn't Ford big tech? Why isn't Raytheon big tech? The way that we think of big tech, I mean, what we're really thinking of are companies that have sort of the economics of a startup, even if they're a more mature company like Google or Facebook, but that have in some sense that the multiplier, the EBITDA multiplier of a startup. And in China, they just don't seem to think that way. They actually seem to think, big tech means aerospace, advanced materials, It
means drones. It means all these different things.
It actually means things you can touch.
Right.
And the fact that we're so over-indexed on LLMs relative to any other potential application of AI, I think stands for, you might characterize it as pathologies, even if you didn't choose to use that word. I think you would say challenges or characteristics of the American economy, right, where there are structural investment barriers to building.
Would your read on, zooming out beyond just, industrialization, just taking the word like innovation as an example, is your read that the Chinese are currently eating our lunch when it comes to that sort of thing, or are regulations like standing in the way of competing on a similar level with the Chinese?
20 years ago, if someone had asked, will the Chinese be eating our lunch? You would have said, you're nuts. Like we would have said, these guys are 5 years away from bicycle commuting. And in fact, the installed base of cars in China 20 years ago was pretty miserable for a country of that size. China doesn't need to get to an American standard of living to cause structural challenges for every other country on earth. China's population is so big that every time the dollar, every time the GDP per capita calculation comes out, every dollar of that represents much more economic activity, aggregate economic activity, than a similar top line figure if you're looking at GDP per capita in Thailand or Colombia, or, the United States. So China's 50% of world manufacturing at this point. Does that cash out to beating the United States? I don't really know what it means. I mean, I think our standard of living is still preferable. They're still, if you believe Scott Rozell's Invisible China, then he was saying that quite recently you still had many school children in the PRC going to school with cases of parasitic worms, or with undiagnosed vision deficiencies and no pathway to get in classes. Now, no doubt the PRC government has started addressing some of that stuff since, but they're starting from a low base, and they still have a lot of people living in really miserable conditions of poverty, such as haven't existed in the United States for a century. So they don't have to beat us to pose a challenge to us. There are plenty of countries in the middle income level where Chinese manufacturing is now more competitive than their own domestic manufacturing.
Right.
And those countries are no longer going to be American export markets. In fact, they might even start deindustrializing. Right. Mm-hmm. And so just by growing without even any hostile intent, and just by being so damn big, China poses a challenge to all of us in every respect.
Yeah, I suppose if you boil it down to its most basic elements, what I'm asking is, traditionally a lot of this technology has been invented, created, started to be manufactured in the United States. And let's say Kamala Harris had won in November, pity the thought, would we have been in a very dangerous position where, the Chinese would be the ones, driving innovation, inventions, exporting technology?
Right. Well, I think that's a really serious question. So, I think we have to start by addressing the elephant in the room, which is IP theft. It definitely happens. There's a past NSA chair who said there are two kinds of American companies, ones that have been hacked by the Chinese and ones that don't know it yet.
Right.
There's the IP theft definitely happens, and it happens on a colossal scale, and sometimes it happens legally. For a very long time, you had to pony up IP as the cost of doing business in China. Obviously, these kinds of JVs are there. The differential enforcement of patents, abuse of standards bodies, all those things are real. But the USSR did all that stuff too, and they didn't produce anything that was really competitive with the United States outside of corners of the aerospace sector. I mean, and then even then, when the Soviets came up with their amazing surface-to-air missile systems that for example, pounded the Israelis in '73, then we turned right around and invented stealth. Like, we were able to keep ahead of their innovation loop, even with the huge amount of resources that they were pouring into those engineering categories. And meanwhile, of course, the rest of their economy was going to hell in a handbasket. Looking at computers specifically, the Soviets busily stole every innovation in the American semiconductor industry. It didn't matter. We were innovating so fast that their entire semiconductor industry and R&D became about reverse engineering what we had been doing 5 years ago. So they were always out of the loop, and we were just growing faster than they could steal. The alarming thing about China, in a lot of ways, is that Chinese innovation is real. And in addition to the ripoff, there's also the organic growth. Now, what the organic growth really looks like under the skin can be hard to tell. But there's no question that China, the easiest way to see this in my field is to go to Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, where you get to see all the Huawei and ZTE and other stuff that you can't get in the United States. And very often what you're looking at, by the way, Huawei buys about a third of the show now. They're a huge player. What you see when you go there is Huawei's industrial suites. It's not just here's our handset, here's our radio. It's, here's the Huawei turnkey package to run a factory. Here's the Huawei turnkey package to run a port. And increasingly, when I travel abroad, the question I'm sort of quietly being asked by foreign officials is, when are the Americans going to get on the board with this stuff?
Yeah, because you don't see Apple doing that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's just not that kind of company. I mean, Huawei is financed by the Chinese government so it can operate with single-digit margins. In the United States, Apple needs to make the Apple tax, right? So they've got completely different models, even though they're both in the handset business. But Huawei is more like LG than like Apple in that it's or Samsung, one of the big South Koreans that while it does have a presence in handset, it doesn't live or die by handset. As we found when we started doing chip sanctions, Huawei was able to survive and thrive even when its handsets were somewhat under pressure. And then they wound up coming up with new innovative handsets that were pretty good using domestic chip design. So, that was sort of a bracing message to us about the effects of our sanctioning policy in the first place. So just to circle back to your question, is China going to outcompete us? Well, again, domains of technological competition are always tough. And in national security circles, very often you don't tip your hand. I believe it was something like, I'd have to go back and look, but it was something like 12 years, I think, between the time that the first Nighthawk, first stealth bomber, was available to the Air Force and when they actually used it to fly a mission. Because displaying that capability was a sign to the other guys that they had to do a whole new R&D cycle on their missile program. And you would prefer to keep them in the dark for as long as possible. Right? So sometimes it's hard to get a sense of what's really out there in terms of innovation. But there certainly is no question that in civilian technologies, the question is increasingly, when are the Americans going to show up with a rival tech suite, which is something it would have been just unthinkable 20 years ago. They would have been saying, the Germans versus the Americans or something like that. Right. No one asks me about the Western Europeans anymore, which I also take as a troubling sign. But in any case, they're asking where are the Americans? And I guess my answer there is that when we talk about reindustrialization, we're not just talking about jobs. We're talking about international trade competitiveness and the ability to maintain everything that comes with that. If we don't have port technology suites, and then ports start upgrading and only Chinese suites are available, then that's a window for Chinese intelligence and Chinese information gathering to be embedded in the physical infrastructure of dozens of neutral countries.
Right.
So we've got it. There are many factors that I think should push us towards taking China seriously and not retreating into avenues of cope like they're only stealing technology or they're only a low wage jurisdiction.
Yeah.
We need a full spectrum appreciation of that, the degree of the competition.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way of of thinking about it. Coming back to this, AI applications in manufacturing, basically the only place where I've seen this, and it may be just because of the circles I run in on X.com, have been like Elon trying to do this in some of his manufacturing facilities here in the United States, but I don't really know of any other examples. So what are we doing?
Well, it's interesting you bring him up because if you go to the SpaceX factory, which is a trip I really recommend if you have the opportunity.
Yeah.
If you go to the SpaceX factory, they have written on the wall all over the place the 5 steps of the Tesla system, and one of them is that you don't automate prematurely. Musk got burned in the early days of Tesla trying to automate processes that he later decided were the wrong processes. And then saying, when you have to retool and rip all that out and eat the capital loss, the idea should almost be to get the process perfect from a manual perspective first, and then figure out how to automate into that.
Right.
So AI automation isn't as easy as just throwing AI at the wall and making sure, and hoping that it sticks.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that you bring up Musk, because all this time we've been assuming that you can't manufacture in the United States. So I think it's very interesting that literally the richest guy in human history manufactures in the United States.
Right.
I've been to the factory. I saw it. It's real. Actually, the SpaceX factory, it's sort of almost like a 1950s GM factory or something like that. You would expect a rocket factory to be like extremely, I don't know how to put it, Star Trek, But you were asking what's innovation. That's sort of an interesting one, because I think a lot of what SpaceX did when they innovated is they figured out what they could get away with doing in stainless steel, what they could get away with doing at low tolerances, or like at poor tolerances instead of at high tolerances. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so that's part of how you get a rocket launch that costs $50 million instead of $300 million. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that's innovation too. And as far as the kind of stuff I'm talking about with Chinese factories and whatnot, very often it's that extremely unsexy stuff. An extra gram of material saved here, an extra 10 minutes of transit time from one factory portion to the other saved here. An unnecessary manual inspection saved here, and to the extent that we start seeing successful AI uptake in the United States, I think that's what we should be looking at is how we shave those pennies, because that's very often what AI is best at, rather than actually designing the thing from the ground up. Although I will say that when they package a Starlink terminal, the entire thing is automated, and it's just like, it goes in, there are like I think 20 stations, it goes on a circular conveyor belt, and then it comes out the other end as a completed kit.
Wow.
So you certainly can do that, but I think that's the last stage in a process of deeply thinking it through, where what you would want to do is engage AI to help you to figure out exactly where you can gain efficiencies, or like where efficiencies can flow through your process.
Yeah, it feels like, over the last couple of weeks when I've been talking to people here in DC, that they've been everyone's been buying this Walter Isaacson biography of Elon Musk. It's like, we need to figure out like the psychological profile of this guy. But one of the things that I actually found most revealing when I read it, which was a year ago, by the way, I did not read it recently.
You're not a bandwagoner.
Yeah, exactly. I like the cut of my own jib. So when I read it a year ago was, this section where, he goes and is like looking at these rockets in Russia and like, is looking at all these different ways that he could do it. And he's just like, well, no, I don't really need that. I don't need this.
And the Russians are sort of condescending to him, right?
Right.
They're like, I'll charge you $200 million.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, why not $70 million? Because I don't like you.
Yeah.
Is the attitude. bad decision, dude.
Yeah, and then ultimately it ends up you can like build it and launch the thing for 50. You know, and it's like it actually ended up being a better deal. And I think one of the things too that's been really cool. I've seen Elon post this a few times because he'll do some caption about this is what we want to do with the federal government, but it's the change in how the actual booster looks over time.
Right. It just gets simpler and simpler. Yeah.
Yeah. It gets simpler, more efficient, and cheaper. So I found that, deeply revealing. But beyond, what Elon's doing in the United States, are there any other players, big or small, that are doing something really impressive here in the United States that like nobody's paying attention to?
I would say so. I spent some time with the space industry, specifically in California. You go to LA for the space industry these days.
Yeah.
In October, and there is all kinds of crazy stuff going on. SpaceX throws off a lot of alums. And some of these people are, were involved in absolutely key missions, and then they came up with some crazy idea of their own. Let me highlight a couple of them. So there's one company that I visited, Varda.
I know those guys.
You know those guys?
Yeah.
Well, just for the benefit of the audience. So Varda literally manufactures drugs in space.
Yeah.
That's not like they will. That's not like the business plan. They actually do it.
Yeah.
They got their second mission in the air right now. They already got their first mission back. I took a photo with the capsule. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So that's an example. Growing crystals in 0G, where you can get a high yield, a very high purity, where you can in some cases grow a polymorph that you couldn't grow on Earth because of atmospheric contamination. Personally, I think that's very cool. There's another company that I visited when I was there, Astroforge. The FCC just wrote them the first deep space commercial license for operations 20 million kilometers from Earth, thereabouts.
Wow.
Because what they're going to do is go mine asteroids.
That's so cool.
The idea behind asteroid mining has been around for a while, but it's been sort of looking for a business plan.
Right.
That's the missing link very often is how does someone actually make money off this? And if you can't make money, then it's blue sky research.
Right.
Right. I guess black sky, 20 million. Sorry. But again, these guys are totally real. They already demonstrated their laser drill in orbit in their first mission. Now they're, on their way to go look at the asteroid that they plan to mine.
Right.
And, speaking of AI applications, there are some AI applications in identifying these asteroids and then navigating to them. So, there's all kinds of cool stuff happening. The space sector is just one example. But I think that it's a particularly germane one to what I do, because since we're writing the licenses for these guys to operate in space, it behooves us to have a process that's going to back them up.
Right. There's this very interesting clip from a couple years ago. It was a conversation between, I'm sure you've seen this with Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson, where they're debating AI. And they're specifically talking about like autonomous vehicles, particularly for like trucking. And basically Tucker's position is, you're going to have millions of Americans who do this, for a living, are going to be very angry, right? Because they've spent their entire livelihoods doing this, providing for their families this way, and they're not going to learn to code. And so when we think about, applications for how people can build like a good and honest living here in the United States, like not every guy that currently works in a non-automated factory is going to go work at Varda.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah, sure. I totally agree with you on that. Although I would say there's a lot of blue collar workers at SpaceX.
Yeah, I believe it.
Yeah. But it's funny. The first place I ran into this point about vehicular autonomy and trucking unemployment was in Andrew Yang's book.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's a big theme with him. He's saying we're going to have a revolution in this country if we put the truckers out of business.
Right.
So we better get ahead of it and do a UBI. So there are different approaches to this question.
Yeah, it's an opposing view.
Yeah, right, exactly. But it is sort of interesting when you see two people with very different perspectives on life identifying what they see as a similar social issue. I guess I don't want to be too Pollyanna about it. But from my point of view, when I started in private legal practice, we were going to a model. We were in the middle of transitioning from a model where a lawyer would have 2 or 3 secretaries to where maybe 3 or 4 lawyers would share one secretary. And you could see why, because some of the older partners, and obviously I'm dating myself a little bit, but some of the older partners would still dictate briefs. And it was crazy. Like they had the mental discipline and just the habit of years and years of practice to just stand up and dictate a brief. And then their secretaries would type it up. It was kind of crazy. I'm not sure that I could dictate a brief. I'm good at various things. I'm not sure I'm good at that. That's very impressive, right?
You still got to put pen to paper.
Yeah, all right, exactly. Well, because I grew up with word processors, and that's a big part of my process. And so I feel like word processors definitely did put typists out of business, but we should have put typists out of business. It's sort of a, there's a ceiling to how advanced an economy you can support if you have to carve out a certain percentage for the mailroom and the typists and all sorts of other things that we have now, more or less automated. Again, a close friend of mine, actually, now my chief of staff, he was working in, he had founded an insurance fintech before we were working together. And one of his points was that improvements to underwriting that would come out of machine learning, which is what you called AI back then. Yeah. But that improvements to underwriting would be good for the insurance business and good for actuaries. It would not actually cause actuaries to go out of business. Rather, it would allow for more differentiation and for a higher level of skill and for much more accurate and value-creating insurance policies to get written. So I look at, everyone knows Milton Friedman's joke, right? Why are these guys digging with shovels? Well, to create jobs. Well, why don't you give them spoons?
Yeah.
And I guess that's more or less how I feel about it. I mean, if what we use AI for is to say that we don't need our labor, then that's bad, but it's also probably unproductive because there's always going to be more room to augment the worker and make him 10 times as productive as there is going to be to replace the worker.
Right.
I mean, if you replace the worker, then you've competed the entire thing down to the capitalization of the, of what it costs to buy the robot or something like that. And at that point, you yourself have commoditized your company because your competition can also build a robot and accept a lower profit margin, whatever it might be. A cheaper robot will come along. Maybe you bought at a disadvantageous time in terms of return on capital versus where it's going to be once the robots get cheaper. You see what I'm saying? So you've put yourself into potentially another situation by removing the chance for workers to add productivity and to be contributors from the equation. How did Japan take over the auto industry? In a lot of ways, back when they had taken over the auto industry, it was because they empowered workers and had ground floor innovations flowing up. That's where all of the Toyota system came from. It was primarily at the level of ground up. Now, it was also partly that Japan had such a low cost of labor relative to the United States that they had an engineer on every production line. But translating the observations of the machinists and the press operators and whatnot into engineering speak that was then legible to management. But there was a productive synthesis across all levels. China runs on the same basis right now, where you've got your raw materials and your prototyping and your mass production all within a mile of each other in Shenzhen, right? And with a flow of workers in between these kinds of things. So I think people will try to cut workers out of the equation because it's an unimaginative MBA way of thinking about fixing up your bottom line.
And we have a lot of MBAs in this country.
Sure. But at the same time, I think the most successful businesses are going to be the ones that really think, what can my workers add to this business and what can I add to my workers?
Yeah.
Just the way Toyota did.
Yeah. I suppose my biggest question is thinking about manufacturing in this way gonna, create a larger labor disruption for people who are already in that market as opposed to people who will be in that market in like 10 or 15 years versus when, word processors maybe put secretaries out of business?
I don't know. I really don't know what a transition like that looks like. First, frankly, we have to find a way to capitalize manufacturing businesses at scale in the United States before we even start having this conversation.
Right.
Otherwise, we're just letting China have the entire pie by default, at which point no one has a manufacturing job.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. I think one of the most helpful ways to think about reindustrializing is, there's a lot of people that write, about the reindustrialization issue, and it's got all these different phrases and that sort of thing that people are always talking about. But I find it a lot more helpful to talk about specific industries, like we've been doing. We've been talking about space. I think the auto industry here is particularly illustrative. This kind of we used to be the hub for this, and then it was Japan, and then China, and all of these different things. So like, give us over the last, say, 70 years, the progress that's been made in terms of auto manufacturing and how we've lost a lot of it here in the United States, and what we could do to bring it back.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd have to have another look at the statistics, but the last time I read Halberstam on this, I want to say that peak production in Detroit before the 73 oil shock was about 11 million units a year. And then post-oil shock, it was about 6 million units a year. It was just too expensive to run an American car. The Japanese manufacturers had a small presence in the market. The Volkswagen had a small presence in the U.S. market, but it was niche. I mean, when, for example, Nissan entered the American market, it was with the equivalent of K-trucks today. Mm-hmm. Small, runty little vehicles that maybe had niches, but, they didn't sell that well because they couldn't go fast enough to drive at highway speeds.
Yeah.
That kind of thing, initially, just in the very early days of attempting to export to the United States. Why were they exporting to the United States in the first place if there wasn't much market? Because that was a cornerstone of industrial policy. If you were going to have an industrial policy, you were going to have to you're going to have to impose export discipline on the participants in that policy. So you see this precipitous decline in the United States, and it was not just opportunism on the parts of other countries. It was a long process of industrial policy that led them to be in a position to step in. The United States obviously had all of the natural advantages: scale, resources. Visionaries like Henry Ford. But the European auto industry was always, a little bit more focused on luxury and upscale more than the mass market in the early days. But post-war, with the United States, in such a dominating position industrially, partly just by virtue of not having blown up, but also by virtue of being such an advanced economy with so much sophistication, we sort of inherited the export markets because it was very difficult to mount a challenge to us, right?
Right.
The Japan got into it. I think an even more interesting case study is South Korea getting into it under Park Chung-hee, because if there's one thing that Park Chung-hee is remembered for, it's running an industrial policy,
right?
And you look at Park Chung-hee's Korea and you get a sense of what really running a tough industrial policy really means. It means CEOs spend a lot of time in jail.
Yeah.
And I mean, like it means that every company has to make its numbers, just like a terrified sales rep. Right. They have to make their numbers every year in terms of exports. They have to they have to justify their allocation of foreign currency. They have to justify their access to government-backed loans. It's, they ran a tight ship in South Korea. Most South Korean auto companies were killed along the way. And who are the big survivors? Hyundai, Kia, right? But no one remembers much about Daewoo. No one remembers SsangYong, which I think is now which I now think is part of Geely. It was, but after going through a period of bankruptcy or something like that.
Right.
So there were a lot of casualties along the way, and it was a tough racket. And but what South Korea got out of that was a real seat at the table in having an indigenous drivetrain that was internationally competitive. So in other words, getting beyond the level of being a kit assembly company that is dependent for its crown technology jewels on imports, and saying, no, we're going to make it domestically from soup to nuts. We're going to know how to make all of the steel, all of the alloys. We're going to know how to do all of the machining. If you've ever had a transmission replacement, then you know what I'm talking about. They're expensive because that's the guts of the car, that and the engine. Those are the crown jewels. The rest is, just sort of trappings around that. But if you don't have that, you don't really have a car company. You have a kit assembly company. Mm-hmm. Now, as far as China, everyone focuses on EVs with China. China has more presence in gas cars than a lot of us would like to admit. I'll get back to that in a minute. But China was never a leading player in gas cars. With EVs, they could jump to the front of the line right away. Why? Because with an EV, you don't really have to have a transmission.
Right.
What you have to have is a really good battery. Mm-hmm. But you don't need a fully baked drivetrain, because the point of a drivetrain is to translate the high RPM and low torque of a gas motor into functional power to drive wheels on a car, right? So, but you don't have this problem with an electric motor. The first time I saw a Tesla in 2015, it was parked at, well, it wasn't parked. It was waiting at a red light in Northern Virginia, where I was moving into my house. And then and it was going uphill. When the light changed, the thing took off. I had never seen a car move like that before because it didn't have to upshift. You just, it's an electric motor. The torque goes right to the wheels. Boom. It was crazy. The acceleration was unreal. It still is unreal for every EV, even a cheap EV. It's unreal.
Yeah,
I understand you just bought a Tesla.
Yeah, I just did. I bought literally the cheapest one, and it goes 0 to 60 in 4 seconds.
In 4 seconds.
It's insane.
Imagine telling your dad that back in the days when, like, getting your Camaro to do that in like 6.2,
right?
Required some tuning. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Imagine going back to the 70s and telling your dad working on cars. Guess what my car does now?
Yeah.
It'd be like, what is it? Nuclear powered? No. It's just
electricity.
It's just electricity. Simple. Yeah, right.
It's battery.
I mean, it's crazy. We had electric car companies in the 1890s in the United States. But of course, we weren't quite at that level of performance. So all this is to, sort of set the stage for the ebb and flow that you see in the auto industry as new players enter, but also have to spend a huge amount of blood and treasure to enter. And there's a big moat. I mean, Hyundai eventually, was competitive with GM. It took a long time. It took a lot of pain, took a lot of capital. And that doesn't mean they destroy GM. It just means that now they have a seat at the table too. But with the Chinese auto industry, they again, speaking of going from 0 to 60, China became the world's leading auto exporter in 2023. And China's opening new auto brands like mushrooms. Now, most of those are going to fail. There isn't enough market for them all to succeed and become the next Hyundai. But some of them are going to be very successful indeed. And I would say that if you're an American and you were, for example, in South America in 2014, and then you went back today, you would notice very different cars on the road. You're not seeing the Renaults, right? You're not seeing the Volkswagens, and you're not seeing increasingly the Fords. You're increasingly seeing Chinese brands. You go to the Middle East. Even in countries where gas is practically free, you'll still see a lot of BYDs on the road. The ugly truth is that if the Chinese can put butts in seats for $10,000 a car, there are a lot of countries that are going to, say, we got no choice but to do this. Our own people are going to string us up if we don't do this because they want cars. They're sick of getting around by motorbike. They're sick of strap hanging. They want a car. They want to be a fully fledged citizen of the 21st century. China's offering us a path. Americans, are you going to stand up? And there are structural impediments to us doing this with our own domestic industry. Some of it's around manufacturing. Some of it's the unique characteristics of the U.S. market, some of which come through regulation, Yeah. So the Trump administration has already repealed some of the Biden cafe regulations. That's great. I think we could continue looking at that. I'm not a DOT guy, but, Yeah. I'm not going to recommend policy to them, but as an amateur, I'd be interested to see where they're headed with it.
Yeah, I should mention you wrote this great piece in American Affairs. I'll make sure that we'll link it in the description so that people can read it. I read it this morning. It was great. That's why we've been talking about a lot of this reindustrialization. And so, what is like the current state of the American market as an example, and what do we need to do to compete, whether it be, some of the regulatory stuff. I'm specifically more focused on like the manufacturing and innovation. What is it that we should be doing?
A lot of the hard tech guys in California have sort of a meme on X.com, formerly known as Twitter, where they'll post a picture of a Toyota Hilux and say something like, "This kind of affordable mixed use urbanism is not we just can't have it in the United States." They're sort of riffing on the idea of courtyard blocks in Berlin or something like that. But there's a serious point to it. Toyota makes very good pickup trucks that I've seen all over Eastern Europe. My wife is Romanian, and they're not legal in the United States, or they're not legal in the aggregate because the way that we measure emissions by vehicular size makes them an unattractive sales proposition.
Right.
And that generally sort of stands for the condition of the United States market, where it's a uniquely rich market. There's a unique focus on large vehicles, and there are also strong regulatory incentives maybe to make large vehicles. I mean, if you sort of remember the like adbusters type rhetoric of the late 90s, early 2000s, it was like, Americans, they want what was it in the Simpsons episode, the Canyonero, right?
Right.
They want the Canyonero because they're all so fat and ignorant and they're all afraid of, and the truth,
everyone wants a Hummer.
Yeah, right. And I mean, the truth is that what it is this is just regulatorily driven in a lot of cases.
Right.
It just makes more sense for the companies to make big vehicles relative to, I mean, I bet you could find a U.S. market if it were sort of legal to do that for exactly the kind of runty, underpowered cars that the Japanese and Germans used to conquer us in the 70s.
Yeah.
Personally, I needed to get a new car recently, and I got, the cheapest little hatchback that I could find because it's nimble and doesn't use a lot of gas. And, I also have a large van because I've got 3 kids. But, if all I'm doing is running to the store for, a few bags of groceries, I'd much rather drive my hatchback. It's, it's comfortable, and we could go smaller. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Not everyone has to drive an SUV, and it's not just American consumption patterns that drive it. It's regulatory focus. But the other side of it is it makes American vehicles hard to sell in other countries. You're not going to have an easy time selling an F-150 in the UK.
Yeah.
The roads aren't built for it. The parking spaces aren't built for it. And frankly, there are cheaper options if you need a pickup truck. First of all, a lot of the pickup truck ecological niche in the United States would be with a white panel van anyways in the UK. But if you do need a pickup truck for some reason, growing up in Canada, my family homesteaded in 1908, and my dad was a working farmer all my life, and as a kid, and very often, it was not some flashy pickup truck. He had this like runty little Isuzu, and it was a fantastic pickup truck. Actually, it didn't sink up very deep in mud. Obviously, if you've got real hauling to do, you have a 3-ton truck for that.
Yeah.
But if what you need is to be able to turn around and drive into a field, it was actually a much better fit for us than some of the bigger American offerings at the time.
Right.
And if you're in the UK, it's like, what do I need this, F-250 for?
Right.
There's not that much market. So I don't know. It's a combination of things. Like a lot of things, there's path dependency. And in the United States, we just have so much money and such a great auto industry and such onerous regulations, and we can be so cut off from the rest of the world market that you put it all together and we go down a path that it makes us increasingly a tech island and an economic island from everyone else. And you can only ignore that for so long before you realize, my God, there's no export market left.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose one of the things that I'm trying to think through here is like, the United Auto Workers as an example, is kind of in the tank for the liberals, which just sort of doesn't really make sense to me because, I mean, maybe it does because some of these companies got, propped up and everyone but Elon is invited to this thing at the White House, and they're kind of, trying to prop up these, companies starting to manufacture EVs. But I don't really understand why, it seems to me like the conservative movement has a much more exciting proposition, which is like, we can peel back some of these regulations so that, it makes it easier for you to make stuff. We want to build an economy where we can make it much more efficient for you to manufacture and provide, jobs for people to work alongside this exciting technology, et cetera. Like, I don't really have any sense for why, a lot of these major companies seem relatively uninterested in, doing a bunch of innovation or, frankly, working with our side.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So you're gonna have to pardon me for relying so much on Musk-centric examples here.
Yeah,
but people who come from sort of the federal rocketry world, the sort of NASA adjacent world, will often sort of look down their noses a little bit at SpaceX and say, there's not really any new technology there. First of all, I disagree. But second, if you look at the substance of this complaint, it's often sort of revealing. So an example is fuel densification. One of the big things that SpaceX went to a huge amount of trouble to do was to figure out how to cryocompress fuel down to a lower volume. Now, the thing about doing that is that it's really hard to keep it cold enough long enough. So they do this thing where they load the payload and then they stick the fuel in at the last second.
Mm-hmm.
NASA looked into doing that in the 80s and concluded, well, we can never do that because with any rocketry program, We only want to load the crew after we've already loaded the fuel so we don't get another Apollo 11, you know? And you can totally see why an institution that's predicated on saving lives and never making a mistake would never really explore fuel densification. It was a blind alley for them. It was not a blind alley for SpaceX. It didn't require SpaceX to invent novel physics. Rather, it required them to solve engineering problems that had been identified and abandoned 40 years prior.
Right.
I think that's new technology, too, in a very different way. So where I'm going with this is you were asking about the UAW, you were asking about the, I guess, unions, manufacturing generally. You were asking why sometimes legacy companies don't want to innovate. Legacy companies have constraints that companies that are run by private capital, the Musk company is the only one that's public is Tesla, right? SpaceX notoriously is not public. If you've got a widely dispersed investor base, and they expect regular stock buybacks or dividends, and they expect predictability from your corporate performance, then you're working within a straitjacket.
Right.
You don't have the freedom to do those bet the company moments. And in fact, it would be irresponsible for you to do so considering the source of your funds. So what does this look like in the future? Well, I would have to assume that a lot of the growth in this area is going to come from non-traditional sources of capital. In the case of, again, of SpaceX, it's like Musk and Founders Fund, and that's sort of it. It's going to come from non-traditional sources of capital. And I think unions are going to have to figure out how to engage with a company that is not, a 100-year-old conglomerate in order to make this happen. I mean, the capital imperatives that are driving GM constrain it sort of the same way that NASA was constrained. It's not that they're dumb. It's not that they can't innovate. It's just that certain solutions are unacceptable. They're ruled out before they happen.
Right.
And so in that situation, you can wind up like sort of the way NASA was until fairly recently, where it was managing decline.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you're sort of in a competition to improve. That's a very interesting way of thinking about it. We're going to go now to the members only section. So in case you need a reminder, you can join us as either a truther or a statesman. You get access to special content, extra couple minutes we do with every guest, as well as events we do here in DC. You get to see our handsome mugs here on YouTube. So make sure to go ahead and check that out. But we're going to go to the members only section now. We're going to talk a little bit about space and the prospective 51st state of Canada. Commissioner, where can people find you, keep up with the work that you're doing at the FCC? Give us, website, social media handles, whatever.
An easy way to find out what's going on at the FCC is to follow at Brendan Carr FCC.
Yeah.
Because
you don't tweet as much, I've noticed.
Yeah. I figure if you average his tweeting out with mine, then you get a normal volume of tweets. I think I've done like maybe a dozen over 4 years.
Yeah.
It's not a big thing with me, but Carr is a very active tweeter, and Chairman Carr is a very active tweeter, and you can keep abreast of FCC developments. As well as sometimes some good political discourse by following his handle. As far as where you're going to find me, I mean, if you go to the FCC leadership page, I'm there with my staff. But I prefer sort of more intimate venues and the written word. I don't really have a huge public presence of the same kind, because at the end of the day, you might not guess it from how prolix I am today, but at the end of the day, I'm sort of back office. I like to sit and dig into the technical details, and every once in a while pop my head and say what I've been learning about.
You have an aura of conspiracy, and then every once in a while we drag you on this show, and people are like blown away, blown out of their chairs. So
it's always a huge pleasure.
Yeah,
great questions.
Likewise. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
It was absolutely a delight.
Thanks for joining us for another fantastic episode of Moment of Truth. As always, you can check out more information about us at AmericanMoment.org. Applications for our summer fellowship for American Statecraft are at AmericanMoment.org/fellowship. And then if you're currently an intern in DC, or you're about to be one and you'd like to join us at AM Fridays, that's AmericanMoment.org/AM Fridays. As always, rate and review the podcast. Every 5-star review helps. We'd really like to continue to grow this show, bring on cool guests. As a reminder, if you would like to join our membership program, you can become either a truther or a statesman on YouTube. Gives you access to bonus content, invites to special events here in DC. All very exciting stuff. Thank you guys very much, and we will see you next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier and Hunter Smith, with original graphics and title cards by Jared Cummings. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is AmericanMoment.org.